Okay, we're live. Greetings, everyone. My name is Michael Chan, and this is the Faith and Firearms Project. I'm here with Dr. Matthew Schlimm. Welcome.
Hello, thanks.
So glad to have you here, and glad that you're willing to talk with us today about this interesting topic of faith and firearms. So, Dr. Schlimm, would you please just tell us a little bit about what you do, your area of research? You're a professor, I understand?
Yes, yeah, I'm an associate professor of Old Testament at the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. We're a Presbyterian Church USA seminary. We also have a decent number of United Methodists here. I'm also an ordained pastor in the United Methodist Church. I was born and raised in Wisconsin. And so it's I'm back here just across the Mississippi River from Wisconsin.
Right. How long have you been at your current post?
I've been here for 7 years now. So I'll be starting my 8th year, I guess, in August.
And so you teach classes primarily in Bible, is that right?
Yeah, I teach Hebrew, both introduction and exegesis, and then I teach Old Testament introduction, Old Testament exegesis, how do we interpret different texts, and I also teach a couple of classes where we try to connect the Bible with big issues nowadays. Not too long ago, I taught a class on New York Times bestsellers and the Bible. So we're looking at popular religious works, and then do they actually fit at all with what the Bible's saying, whether they claim to or not? So
that is a fascinating project.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun, and it was a lot easier reading than some of the stuff I have to read otherwise.
I believe that, and maybe more entertaining.
Yeah.
So we've known each other for a couple of years and have some common acquaintances, mostly because we're both within the same field. But then I think maybe a month or so ago, you came across this project, the Faith and Firearms Project, I think through a common friend. What was interesting to you about some of the questions that I'm dealing with in this project?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, at first of all, you raise this question, what's the connection between faith and firearms? And, personally, I'm a pacifist. My dad was a pacifist. So I initially heard this and I thought, well, nothing, but then I stopped myself and I thought, wait a second here, the more I thought about it, the more I realized there actually are some really interesting connections on a variety of levels. And so that really got me thinking more and more. And so I shot you an email, I think, and then we started talking from there.
Can you, Matthew, I think pacifist is a relatively common word within the English language. Most people would know, but how would you define that?
That's a great question. I would say, first and foremost, I'm opposed to war. I don't see that as a solution that's viable. Something that I think, makes me different from a lot of, gun owners is that, I personally think it would be better to die myself than to kill someone. I just wouldn't want to go through life knowing that I had ended another person's life. Whereas, when I talk with people at my church, for example, most of them do own guns. And when we have discussions about why do they own guns, a lot of them say, well, there are crazy people in this world and you need it to defend yourself from them. So that's in terms of practical realities, that's, I'm opposed to war and violence, in my personal life as well. I do recognize the complexities of the issue. A lot of the world's great pacifists have made allowances for things like police forces, even while they're opposed to things like war. So I recognize that there's certain complexities. I also recognize it's easy for me to be a pacifist sitting, here in the United States in an air-conditioned office, whereas, you look at some of the realities that people in other parts of the world have to face. And I recognize there are difficulties there that, make it much easier for me to be a pacifist where I am than might be the case elsewhere.
Would you say that, are you PCUSA? Is that what you said?
No, actually, I'm United Methodist.
Oh, you said you were United Methodist. Oh, it's just that your school has a lot of Presbyterian
Right,
students.
right. Yeah, we're one of the official denominational seminaries.
Got it, got it. Would you say that your pacifist position is a minority position within Methodism?
Yes. I think that if you were talking with clergy, there'd probably be more people, a higher percentage would be sympathetic to that. Officially, the Methodist Church does have a stated doctrine on it, and it basically says that, you know, we're the type of denomination that welcomes pacifists, but that, you know, I mean, one of my ordination questions was, if one of my congregation members said that he would go to war, would I, you know, be able to support him? And I wasn't quite as much into pacifism when I had to answer that question as I am now. I think it would maybe be a more challenging question for me now. But yeah, we're not like, you know, say the Mennonites, who have a very set, you know, I don't know if doctrine's the right word, but at least a certain, you know, fairly standard set of beliefs and practices around this topic. United Methodists tend to be much more diverse.
Okay, sure. And you know, it's fascinating that I'm going to go a little bit off of our intended course for a second, but you and I are both Hebrew Bible professors, and the question of violence in the Hebrew Bible is often raised, at least in my classrooms, and I imagine also in yours. And it's really not so much a Hebrew Bible question only, it really is a canonical question, because the God of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament engages in violence, and sometimes deeply disturbing violence. So how does that fit into your view of pacifism, this idea of God as that God enacts violence, in fact, against God's own creation?
That's a great question, and it's one that I've struggled with a lot. In fact, my latest book, I have a chapter just sort of wrestling with this question, and I say there are times when, you know, I read certain texts of the Old Testament, and the best I can do is prayerfully say, why on earth is this in our Bibles? It doesn't always make sense to me. I think that's
actually
okay.
done work on divine anger, right? I mean, you've done a lot of work on divine wrath.
Yeah. And I mean, one point I do try to make is I do think that there's quite a difference between, you know, divine, you know, it's one thing to say that a just God who knows everything, every motive, you know, every background, every psychology, that God, you know, is willing to in some way determine who lives and who dies. I think it's a very different matter altogether, though, when human beings try to say, I have the power to decide that as well. In that sense, I think there are certain ways in which humans should not try to be godlike, and that would be one of them. But yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult issue. I mean, and you know, I mean, I'll just share from my personal life. When I went over to Israel and Palestine, and I saw these homes, these Palestinian homes that had been shot at point blank range by tanks. And I walked into them and I saw, you know, a child's bicycle covered in rubble. I had a real problem with the Old Testament for quite a while after that. It really shook up my ability to, you know, read it in a peaceful way, because I mean, because I could see so easily how the narratives of the Bible could be used to try to justify that kind of violence. But then to see the boy whose bike that was, I mean, it made me, it was a real sort of, you know, one of those moments in your life that shake your faith, that make you question things. And yeah, I'm not sure that I'm any closer to having answers to those sorts of questions. It's more that I've made my peace with having questions.
Sure. Yeah, very well said. Right. Well, that was a bit of a detour, but actually one that I think is somewhat relevant, at least to the topic, insofar as it deals with the relationship between or the distinction, in fact, that you make between divine violence and what is permissible human violence, because you do kind of make a distinction there, at least as I heard you.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess maybe if I'm interpreting you correctly, on some level, you're saying that to engage in violence from a pacifist perspective, or your perspective, is to take up a prerogative that belongs to God alone.
Yes. Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. So then let's turn to the question of guns. Obviously a big topic in America right now, obviously related to violence, and at least I think there are some connections to religion, and that those connections are not monolithic. They're actually pretty complicated and pluralistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do guns symbolize to you? I mean, just as you kind of think about the whole discourse in America about guns, about how it's talked about, for you as an academic, what do guns symbolize?
That's a great question. You know, I grew up in around a lot of you know, people who owned guns. Like I said, my family didn't, but a lot of my, you know, friends and family members would. And I think that in rural Wisconsin, one thing that guns symbolized was this rite of passage into manhood. You were a man when, well, you were starting to become a man when you had shot a gun. And then once you had your own, when you, especially when you'd maybe used it and you had, you know, killed your first buck, then you were really a man, you know. And there were some other cultural artifacts that went with that. If you owned a pickup truck, you know, that was a big deal. You know, but that was, I mean, I felt like in some ways, I mean, it was this fishing and hunting sort of culture. And fishing was something that was open to people of all ages and stuff. But hunting, that was something that little kids didn't mess with. You know, and in that sense too, I think that you know, guns also symbolized responsibility. I mean, because you can view that sort of manhood connection with guns through a lens of skepticism that says, oh, you know, it's this machismo sort of thing, and you know, you need this external thing to. But there's something you can also view it with a more generous lens, and it says that, you know, when you're an adult, you know, you're responsible for yourself, you're responsible for your family, you're responsible for protecting them, you're responsible for providing food for them. And you know, there's this sense of respect and responsibility that went along with, you know, gun ownership, and the people that I knew growing up and still know today. And you know, so there it's not all this sort of, you know, just Mr. Macho Man, I've got a gun. It was, no, you only, you know, it's only when you're old enough, it's only when you've been through the proper, you know, safety training courses, things like that, then you get your gun. And I think that there is sort of a reverence, and you know, I mean, it goes beyond just, I think, respect, but even to the point of reverence, that when you're holding a gun, in certain ways, I mean, you have access to something bigger than yourself, to determining what lives and what dies. And that sense of transcendence, it packs a lot of things. I mean, when you pick up that cold metal, and it's heavier than any object you typically pick up, and it's colder than most things that you pick, you know, at room temperature. It's colder. There's sort of, I think, this, you know, people see it as sort of this sacred object, you know, in our time. So yeah, I think it relates in a lot of ways to manhood, to responsibility, to respect, to reverence, and even to a sense of transcendence.
Thanks for sharing that. There's a scholar at Duke Divinity named Willie Jennings. Do you know?
Yes.
Yeah, he was just here on campus actually, and he had recently given a paper about violence in America, and we had an opportunity to talk. And he and I had both kind of been thinking along similar lines about the relationship between kind of this constellation, so the relationship among fathers, sons, and guns, and
Hmm.
how there's a kind of inheritance issue
Yeah.
that comes into play. You talked about it in terms of rite of passage, but I think one could also talk about it in terms of inheritance. Do you think
Yeah.
that's?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a real sense of, yeah. I mean, a literal inheritance when someone dies, I mean, the guns, that tends to be a big issue, a big concern. Who does that go to? Um, and I also think that in our culture that is resistive to people displaying emotions, especially men, um, it's difficult for fathers and sons to bond over emotions. I mean, a lot of times people say the one time I saw my dad cry was such and such, right?
Hmm.
It's not that you always have these displays of emotions between fathers and sons. So there's that issue, and so guns and hunting is a way of fathers and sons to connect who maybe don't have an emotional connection through other means. So in that sense, I mean, maybe a more figurative inheritance that's passed on among the living. This is something we do together. This is a way that we bond.
And somehow, yeah, inheritance is kind of this deeply historical reality as well, that to inherit something is also to um, somehow be placed into a larger story, maybe a family story or a story of
Mm-hmm.
history. I interviewed the wife of a former Marine the other day, and she was talking about her husband and how he collects a certain type of gun, and how that particular gun kind of ties him to a certain time in military history, a time, in fact, when his own either father or grandfather served.
Hmm.
And so when you look at something like that, you think, wow, that is such a complicated network of meaning making.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let me just consult my list really quickly. Okay, so you're a public theologian, and you're obviously interested in kind of contemporary issues. I mean, I'm thinking about your New York Times bestseller class. You're interested in engaging questions of theology and contemporary dynamics. And so, if you were given 30 minutes and you had kind of the attention of all Americans, as it were, this is a very fictitious scenario, um, and you kind of had this national megaphone, uh, what would you be interested in saying to the broader public, or perhaps even just to people who are engaged in this debate around guns in America?
Well, I think one thing that might people, and they're thinking about it on both sides, is we tend to focus, I think, on actions and how actions occur. And it's interesting. Part of my training is as a rhetorical critic, and there's this theorist named Kenneth Burke, Burke, who's really big among rhetorical critics. And he says when you're analyzing a piece of discourse, you should look at 5 things. And he's got special terminology for this. There's the act, what happened, what's the action. There's the agency, how is the act actually performed. The purpose, why do agents act? But then there's also the agent themselves, who is involved in the action, and the scene. Where is it happening? And when I think about specifically the Bible and guns, I think 2 things that are really worth reflecting on would be the scene and the agent. Okay,
Hmm.
I think that we tend to focus on gun violence, and okay, so a murder is occurs, and it occurs. The agency is that there's a weapon available that can do this, more quickly or more easily than with some other weapon, things like that. But I think a lot of attitudes about guns in America derive from how people understand the world we live in and how they understand humanity. And I mean, when I think about, people who are in favor of having guns, a lot of them, I mean, of course, it's very diverse, but I think a lot of people have an understanding of the broader world as a threatening place. In many ways, it's an Old Testament world, okay, in the sense that it's a fallen creation, you could say. There's this sense in which, like the book of Isaiah talks about, sort of creation becoming undone, and these wild animals coming in and thorns coming in. And, in Genesis 1, when God creates humanity in God's image, there's this idea that humanity needs to subdue the earth. And, this often comes up in debates about the environment, but I think that it's even more relevant with something like the gun issue. There's this idea that nature is wild and we need to carve out a place for ourselves to live in this wild world. And it's not easy. And so you need something, like a gun to survive. I mean, my grandmother was a farmer with my grandpa when he was still alive, and they had these farm dogs, and every decade or so there'd be a point in which the dog was looking really crazy, and then there was like this raccoon that was just hanging out near the dog. And we figured, okay, this is probably rabies, and every time, one of my uncles would come or cousins would come and shoot the raccoon and the dog. And, I mean, I suppose technically they could have called animal services or something like that and asked them to come out. But when, the cow yard is 20 yards away and it's filled with cows and you've got a potentially rabid animal, you want to take care of that thing right away. I think there's, I think one factor that really does inform whether people think it's right to carry guns or not, or have guns, is their understanding of how the world works, how safe the world is, and so I think that's one thing that's a key issue. I think another key issue is how we understand humanity. And a key thing that the Bible emphasizes, of course, is that there's, evil in human hearts, that people are far from perfect. And I think that then can lead to two very different positions on guns. On the one hand, I think some people would say, yeah, humanity is messed up and there are going to be crazy people out there with guns. So I, as somebody who's not totally crazy, need to have one myself to protect myself and my family. On the other hand, I think there are those who would say, yeah, humanity is fallen. We're all sinful. So why on earth would you have something that can lead to life or death in your home, given, what we know about humanity and our own limitations? And so, yeah, I guess I would, if I had something to say to the American public at large, I would urge them to maybe shift the debate away from some of the cliches you hear over and over again nowadays, and more to a debate over what kind of world do we really live in, and what judgments should we make about human nature, including people who maybe are not very emotionally stable, but also about ourselves and our own limitations. And I mean, in addition to even just emotional limitations, I mean, one reason I don't have a gun in my house is, I've read stories of accidents that have occurred, with children who get into the guns, or somebody who ends up accidentally killing a family member, thinking they were, an intruder or something like that. Those things I think would be a useful way to, I think, move the conversation forward, or at least give us things to talk about other than the same old cliches.
Yeah, those are fascinating observations, Matt, and really similar to, those are some similar questions that I've thought about too as I go through some of these interviews, that I think how people think about guns is almost, it's really an epiphenomenal issue. It's something that is kind of up here, but things get much more interesting when you say, okay, that's one expression, but it's an expression of a particular worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that worldview give birth maybe to different epiphenomenal things, like, for instance, how one relates to the question of guns. And so it makes me wonder if one of the questions I should ask in my regular interviews is describe the world that we live in. That could be really interesting, just to hear how people would reflect on that.
Yeah, I think it's George Lakoff has a book we've called Moral Politics, where he frames the world in terms of, or at least the governing government in terms of a family, and how do you see the family in relation to the broader world. And he argues basically that liberals see the broader world through this nurturing parent metaphor, whereas conservatives tend to see it more through this, stern father type of thing, and the world is more dangerous. And you can certainly see with that, I think there's some limitations to what he's arguing, but you can certainly see how firearms play out, in light of those sorts of understandings about the world.
Yeah, I think his book, it's funny that you should mention that, because I was thinking exactly of that book as you were reflecting. I think it's called The Political Mind, a cognitive scientist's guide to your brain and its politics.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I think that's it. In any case, yeah, that, I should actually do a review on that book for this project. I think people might find that interesting, and then try to think about it in terms of think about the question about faith and firearms in terms of that particular book.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Could be interesting. Yeah. You've already reflected on this a bit, but do you think, or what kinds of resources does your faith provide you with as you think about your own personal response to guns in America? And you could, it doesn't have to be just Bible. It could be, figures or concepts within your own, view of the Christian tradition.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I've already, touched on, biblical views of the world and humanity. To me, one thing that, I remember, on the playground at school growing up, two people would have an argument, and somehow it would turn into, the way to solve this argument was, to start throwing punches. And it's kind of like, well, as I reflect on that as an adult, it's like, okay, how does, who is the better puncher or fighter in any way relate to the argument, they were having, whether it's like, no, you were out, no, I wasn't, it's just whatever. To me, there is a certain level of absurdity when it comes to violence that, is difficult for me to understand. I do think that a question really, when I was in college, I visited a friend who lived in married student housing, and he showed me the gun that he kept under his bed. And he said to me something along the lines of, Matt, if you're ever thinking of buying one of these, you need to ask yourself, am I okay with taking a human life? And, I guess in different ways, I've wrestled with that question. And I just don't think I ever would be. I think one question that Christians should really struggle with is it better, to die yourself than to kill somebody else? I mean, if we are people who believe in the resurrection and do believe there's a just God, maybe it's better, for us to lay down our lives than to, to take somebody else's. And I think that question it's easy when I'm talking about me, myself. When I'm talking about protecting my family, though, then that becomes a much more complicated issue.
Oh.
One thing to say, I'll lay my life down instead of killing somebody else. But when it's like my kids, my wife's life are on the line, that gets a lot more complicated. So I don't have an easy answer there.
Hey, Matt, may I jump in and just ask a follow-up question about that?
Yeah.
Why does it become more complicated at that point?
Well,
when you bring in really bring in those who are close to you or those whom you love.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, sometimes my wife and I will be talking about, somebody did something that made one of us mad. And sometimes, one of us will get more upset about the wrongdoing than the person who was actually wronged. It's like, she'll get more upset at the person who wronged me, and I'll get more upset at the person who wronged her than she is at that person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just that we love others so much more, or if it's like, I mean, like when I think about my kids, it's like, I mean, I've been alive for this long. I want them at least to get to live this long. I want, things to be fair for them. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question, though. I think I need to reflect on that more.
Well, these are definitely not easy questions.
No.
These are matters of life and death, quite
Yeah.
literally. And those are hard questions to respond to. Last question, and then I apologize, but I'll have to go after the next one.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I'm sure you're busy as well. As you look across the conversation about guns within America, are you hopeful, or are you in despair, or how do you kind of respond to it?
I wouldn't say I'm especially hopeful. And yeah, I mean, there was an act of gun violence not too far from my house just yesterday, where a father killed his daughter, which I don't know. In some parts of the country, maybe that happens more frequently, but here in Dubuque, Iowa, where I live, it's not the type of thing where every night there's a new murder to report. I think, politically, I wonder to what extent America has lost its sense of the common good. To what extent, with the internet, people tend to insulate themselves with people who believe similarly and are less open to people of different perspective. The political situation seems to be especially polarized. And then, if I had a really super high view of humanity, I'd maybe be more hopeful. But I mean, in my circles, the dominant narrative is that the church was very hopeful at the start of the 20th century. And, we even had this magazine, The Christian Century, come out, because the 20th century is going to be the century where Christianity was going to thrive and all these world problems were going to get solved and there'd be no more war. And, 2 world wars later, and, you think about all the tragedies that have happened. It's hard for me to say, yes, I'm hopeful about how things will move forward. And then you throw on to that, stories of war and of genocide happening overseas. That nobody seems ready to, or able at least to step in and stop. So yeah, to be totally frank, I'm not super hopeful, about things as they are. I haven't given up ultimate hope. You know, God has a way of doing new things that are unexpected. But yeah, I mean, at the present time, you know, I'm not sure how this world can, on this particular topic, can become a better place. Yeah, I mean, that's my honest assessment.
Right.
But yeah, I wish I could be more hopeful. But I mean, realistically, it's difficult.
Well, Dr. Schlimm, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about this and for sharing your perspectives.
Yeah, thanks for your interest. Anytime.